Welcome everybody to Therapists Supporting Therapists. I am Michelle Lundstrom and I am here with Bridget Boursiquot, and she is a clinical social worker and has some really great information for us today. Thank you for joining us, Bridget.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so I know you have a lot of specialties in working with families, working with couples, premarital, anxiety, stress. You have all kinds of things that you specialize in, and would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself?
Of course, sure. Like you said, I am a clinical social worker. So that means I carry a licensed independent clinical social work degree and license. And I work primarily with adults, mostly adult women, but I do have men on my caseload. I work with couples, and so I work premarital couples and couples kind of going through unhealthy behavior patterns. With my individuals, I tend to work with anxiety or stress, life transitions, big change. And so you can see how that kind of fits into exactly what everybody's going through right now, which is why my niche has expanded a little bit. But as far as modalities, I typically do online work. So I am not going through that change personally as a therapist because I've always done online platform, and I do video, phone. I've also done what I call self-care therapy, where I will meet somebody and go for a walk or sit on a park bench or do something along those lines just to add in another element of self-care. But yeah, that's where I'm at now, and that's where I'll continue to be.
Oh, thank you so much. With all that background and having already done that transition and having your practice via telehealth, you have so much good information to give us. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about all this.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah. So in working with so many couples and families and adults and many mental health providers, this transition over to telehealth is new and different. And so during this time, they're at home a lot of times, and children are also out of school and home. Can you give us some tips for navigating this as parents and navigating this change?
Yeah, so it's tough. I think speaking through the lens of a parent and a therapist and somebody who constantly works from home, I can understand all of the change that's going on in so many different directions. And so the biggest tips I have are really across the board. And that is about routine. I think that we put so much pressure on the routine. And so I want to emphasize that when I say routine, I don't necessarily mean structure every minute of your day. I don't necessarily mean make your kids sit down and do 2 hours of academics before they're allowed to do A, B, and C. I only mean whatever works for you and your family. And with routine, our bodies and minds are kind of expecting something from us. So when we get up, are we eating breakfast? Are we doing our workouts? Are we doing, those basic things that we're doing every day anyway? Are we waking up at the same time every day, going to bed the same time every day, eating healthy foods? Is there something that our bodies and minds can count on that we're doing every day without fail? And so sometimes that means parenting. Sometimes that will mean the academic structure for some people. That is more of the specific this time to this time, because that's what works with them and their family. That's what helps them to be able to do their work. If you're in a couple, sometimes it's leaning on each other differently to say, okay, you focus on the kids from this time to this time so I can go be in a session, whereas I'm going to focus on the kids from this time to this time and you can get your work done. And sometimes it's leniency. So with that routine, my first tip is to have some routine, whatever that looks like for your family. And then the second big tip I have for parents is to give yourself some grace. And by that, if it doesn't work out perfectly the first time, the first week, the first month that we're doing this, then don't be afraid to make changes. Don't beat yourself up about it. There's going to be no, parent quarantine of the year trophy at the end of this. So don't I think parents in general often have this competitive, are you working from home or are you a stay-at-home mom? Are you breastfeeding or are you bottle feeding? Are you, baby led, or are you, all of these different mentalities? And I think this is the perfect time to throw all of that competition out of the window, because this levels that kind of playing field, so to speak, to say we're all really doing this in such a different way, unexpectedly together. So let's help each other through that. Let's say, okay, you don't want to teach your kids for 14 hours a day, don't. If you want to give them an extra hour on the iPad or the screen, go for it. There's no judgment. And I think we have to take that into our own mentality too, and not judge ourselves and our own thoughts and our own actions, and just tweak where we need to.
Yeah, if we can really move into that being collaborative instead of competitive, whether it's competitive with ourselves or others.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's so important. And you bring up a lot of good points, and with the routine and not getting so rigid in that we feel like then we failed or move into shame if we don't do it just right.
Right. Shame and guilt is something I'm hearing from a lot of the parents that I'm working with right now. Like, I didn't do this well enough, or I'm not a teacher, or I'm not, there's already enough parental guilt about everything that we do or what we couldn't do. And I think attaching that to this uncertain time is just too hard on yourself. Let go of some of that expectation and give yourself some grace, and just see, okay, if this didn't work, then what am I going to do different tomorrow? I'm asking the clients that I work with, the therapists that I talk to, even myself, I wake up and I think, okay, what does my body need today? What does my mind need today? And who am I going to connect with? And if you can focus on just those 3 questions, you're doing a lot more than you realize.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Do you have any other self-care tips for managing that fear and that anxiety coming up while we're supporting clients and our families during this time?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice is that we have to start practicing what we preach, right? I think with with self-care, it's something that I preach so much with my clients that they, pick on me if I don't bring it up in a session because they think I'm slipping or something. I think with self-care, it's so constant, and probably such a small subset of people do the self-care that they need on a regular basis. And now that people need it even more, they're doing it even less, and that skews things even more so. So with self-care, I think, especially as therapists, we're holding space for our children, for our partners, for our communities, for our clients, for our parents, a lot of us. And so I think we need to also be careful to hold space for ourselves and to ask other people to hold space for us. I think this is the perfect time to get a therapist as a therapist if you don't have one. I think some of the best therapists have their own. And then with that said, the idea there is that we're all kind of needing that outlet. I tend to look at myself as more of a strainer than a receptacle, because we have the skills to kind of reflect back and give back what our clients need. But when we're holding this for so many different people, it becomes that strainer even gets full, right? So we have to be able to have somebody else to talk to put it out there, to get it out of our thoughts. So your basic self-care tools, whatever that looks like for you, whether that's exercise or yoga or meditation or just talking to somebody else, whatever works for you. I can't name that for you, but how I define self-care is something planned, something intentional, and something that brings you joy while you're doing it and leaves you feeling even slightly rejuvenated when it's complete. So for me, that's having my morning coffee by myself in the quiet, thinking about the day ahead, taking a deep breath of the way it smells. Those deep breaths help me. The intentionality helps me. The thought process of planning my day, all of that is self-care to me, because I also plan to do it and I do it with that framework in mind. I think there's something really important about the intentionality behind it, because let me use exercise as an example. If we're exercising every day and that feels good to us, and we can call it self-care, as long as it doesn't turn into a chore. So the second that that becomes something else we have to do or some other box we have to check, it's not necessarily self-care anymore. It feels more of like that to-do list. But if you're doing it with the intentionality of this is self-care, this feels good to me, this is what my body needs, this is what my mind needs, that changes the framework for it. So I think the intentionality for ourselves is really important in this time.
Yeah, so many of us are on the front lines, whether it's through video or some therapists are still out in the communities that work in hospitals and prisons and other places. And so, yeah, that self-care is so critical.
Yeah, I think it's tough because, we're in the trenches. Social work, if you've gotten into this to get the big recognition or the big paycheck, then it's probably really disappointed. But and there are ways to do all that, I joke. But I think that ultimately right now our work is just at the beginning of these ramping up. I think that, yes, we are all doing trauma work. We're all working with PTSD. I think the whole world at this point could be diagnosed literally, quite literally, with at least acute stress disorder, if not adjustment disorder or something even more. And I think with that in mind, we should also be taking the self-care of getting the trainings that we need. So if you haven't done online training for becoming a telemental health provider, there's so many free resources for things like that right now. If people want to reach out, I'm happy to help guide them because it's something that I've done before. I think that there's also a need now to do more. If you haven't had the training in trauma work or in PTSD, this is the time to be up on that and to make sure you're doing these things, because if you haven't seen it now in your clients, you likely will as this fades out, because this isn't something from a mental health perspective that's going anywhere anytime soon. People are going to have a hard time adjusting back to a new normal, or feeling the effects of all of this in many different ways, from financial to relational to, anxiety and all of these other things that are going to keep showing up in our field.
Yeah, that is a really good point, that if people haven't trained in trauma yet, it is an important time. This as we're going through this, it kind of brings back some professional flashbacks for me of my early career. I worked with Hurricane Katrina survivors exclusively for probably about a year and a half or so. And so there was a lot of similar kind of feelings going on. I mean, a natural disaster, but this is kind of an invisible natural disaster. Like they can't pan on the video on the news to destruction and say this is why there's a problem. It's so invisible, and so it's a little bit different in that way. Much like PTSD, it's an invisible injury.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of doctors and nurses and frontline workers on my client base, and I feel like it's almost like they're being drafted. I have a lot of people who are working with vets who are like having that kind of flashback, that are feeling like they're being drafted into some kind of war. Or, there's so many different perspectives, like you're talking about Katrina. I've had a lot of people, yeah, I grew up in New York, so I have a lot of people talking about 9/11 and the effects of those things coming back, and just being those frontline workers of the emergency response teams and things like that. So yeah, this is connected to people in so many ways, and I think the trauma work is showing up for everybody right now, but it will continue to, because of this as well. So we're being impacted in both directions with trauma work.
Yeah. And one question that I keep getting from people, and I know it's coming from an anxious place, but and I wish I could answer them, is when are we going to move back to in person or face to face, or get things back to normal? And even my clients will say it to me jokingly sometimes, because they know I can't answer. And this all feels so open-ended yet temporary at the same time. Can you tell us ways that maybe you are or would navigate this question?
Yeah, well, I don't do in person very much, so it's a different answer for me. but I think it's not going to go back. I really don't. I think if we let go of that and have some radical acceptance of what we're dealing with as therapists, of what's going on in the world, of what we can change and what we can't change, all of those conversations that we're constantly having with clients, we have to have in our own self-talk too. So what is going to change? What normal is worth revisiting. So I think a lot of people are going to add telehealth to their repertoire. I think people will still meet in person, don't get me wrong, and there's a need for that, absolutely. But I think more people are going to start doing telehealth. I also think that there isn't, like I said, there isn't going to be going back. There's going to be a new version of this normal. And so I think with you and your clients talking about what that might look like, what they're missing, what is it that's prompting that question, that desire to connect? Maybe that's where it's coming from. So do you start talking then about how they can connect in their environment, in their community? How can they can feel something? What are they missing from the on screen that's making them really want that in person? So for me, it would turn into a different kind of conversation, because I think we as therapists are feeling some of that too when you switch. And I remember going online and being like, oh, is this going to be weird? Am I going to have a hard time connecting? And there's so many tips in that regard too for therapists who haven't done this before. Make sure your screen is up so that you can look at and make eye contact still. I think that there's a lot of comfortable settings that you can have. I'm not sitting at a desk. I'm sitting against a cushion here. So I think making yourself comfortable in different ways. When you're comfortable, your client is going to be comfortable. I think there's something wonderful about them being able to be in their home environment and not having to travel and do that, to be able to make it happen. And the comfort of their home environment can bring another dynamic. The tricky part that I talk to clients about too is that there's also no travel to and from. And I think a lot of that processing for clients when they're rejoining their family or going back to work or whatever it is that they're walking away from after a session, they don't have that time anymore. So I always tell them, okay, when we hang up, what are you going to be doing for 5 or 10 minutes before you rejoin your partner or your family or your work or whatever that is? So we have to do that too. When we are stepping back as therapists from a session, it's like, you can't just run from your kids or your spouse or cooking dinner and go have a session and run back and think that, the world is just going to keep going so smoothly. We have to be able to block time, create that transition in our thought process and our, physical abilities, and stretch our bodies differently, those kinds of things, to pay attention to it. So I veered completely from your question, but I wanted to touch on those things because I think it's all kind of related.
Yeah, it is. And all of that is so important. I'm so glad that you veered from the question, because that was really great. And I really like that tip. I hadn't thought of that actually, of, asking people to do a 5 to 10 minute exercise or journaling or something where they can really kind of have that commute time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I asked my clients to come up with what might work for them. And some of them are like, I just want to lay, for 5 minutes. I'm like, great, do it. Some people want to do something more productive, like journaling or listening to music or doing a quick meditation. I think stretching, some kind of change of scenery, all of that is really helpful. But yeah, I think it's helpful for us too, as therapists, to do that. And I think that's the really important piece for our self-care too, is the transition from client to client, the transition from client to home life. That kind of work-life balance really shifts, and we have to pay attention to what that feels like and how we can manage that, compartmentalize, so to speak, but in a healthier way.
Yes. Yes. Lots of self-care for us. And I like that the transition for us as well is so important, and how we're navigating that, and giving ourselves the time in the day to do
Right.
that, and not be so focused on, okay, well, the kids are home, so I need to be focused on them, or
Mm-hmm.
there's a
Absolutely.
balance in all of
Right.
it. Yeah. So what have you learned about yourself in this process with COVID-19, and as being a healer, and finding that balance of also being a human being that's impacted by this?
That's a really good question. I think I'm learning every day. I think I'm learning to give myself some grace too, right? That I think, um, when we're talking, I think all these questions, I'm doing these Zooms or meetings or podcasts, or I do lives to help people. I think that overextension that we were talking about before we hit record today about kind of being out there for everybody, finding ways to connect to the community and things like that are really important to me. And so I'm learning that it's not just about the one-on-one of the client and I that I really loved, but it's the connection to being a helper to helping the community, to helping individuals, to being, even just, and I shouldn't say just, being a home and being a mom and being a wife and doing all of those things are also very important to me, and I get to do that. And so I think what I've learned is the master of the reframe, right? Those cognitive reframes and challenges that are, how do I look at this differently? How do I really have, I mentioned earlier, this radical acceptance. And I think that in the past we've done it, okay, this is just this kind of day and we'll manage it differently. And I think those cycles are going faster for everybody, that we don't have a bad day. We might have a bad minute, and then the next minute is great, and the next hour is wonderful, and the next hour is, oh my goodness, I can't believe this happened, or this news, or this whatever. And I think having those cycles faster is something that I'm learning to manage and deal with and understand in the people that I am meeting. I also am understanding much more blatantly, I guess is the word, as to how kids are managing their anxieties. I think even though kids are not my client base, parents happen to be, and I have my own. And so revisiting some of the work I've had with kids is really important, because children are managing these changes so differently. Just, again, varying, but this is, I've had a lot of parents tell me, for example, their, 8-year-old is coming in to lay in bed with them at night, or their 5-year-old is like, hey, can you play this game with me? Or I want to be with you, or I just want to sit, or is, unusually tearful, or unusually angry, or, all of these, the key phrase there is like, this isn't their typical behavior. They're unusually like this. Or is this what their teachers deal with? Because I haven't seen it. Those kinds of comments are so rampant right now, because kids don't have the language to say, I'm really stressed out, or I'm really frustrated, or I'm lonely, or I want to connect, or I'm nervous, or all of these words for the big emotions that they're having. And so the other big thing that I'm learning about myself is how to work with kids without working with kids. And I think we all have to do that to an extent too right now, for people who have them, for therapists who are trying to manage that at the same time.
Yeah, that can be a big challenge, because that's not something most therapists are used to, is having their children with them all day, every day. And I think,
Yeah.
and all the families we work with as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I've done just to manage that differently, I know that this doesn't work for people who are, single parents, but as a therapist, I tell my kids, I think setting expectations is really important in any relationship. So there's expectations that are set, there's activities that they can choose from, so that they have a level of control over their environment of what's going on. I said, I ask myself the questions, what does your mind need? What does your body need? I ask my kids those same questions, so that they can start to learn those words and take control over their environment and self-regulation and those kinds of things. So I encourage all of us therapists to do that with their families and with the clients, but also to say, it's okay, what you need to do this for an hour, you need to, watch the TV for an hour, or to have that really transparent conversation with your spouse when we haven't. I think sometimes when we have a need and an ask attached to that need, it puts us in a vulnerable place. Anybody in relationships, when you're asking your partner, hey, can you do this? I need this to happen. It's tough to do over and over again. But I think with that level of transparency, that's how the communication is going to work in all of this, with people with multiple adults in the home that can help manage kids during therapy sessions.
Yeah, that can really help. Yeah, and I know that's such a struggle, in being able to give ourselves grace. And I love those questions to ask of yourself. Another question that I think of is, with managing kids at home, is, what is it I don't understand, and what is it they don't understand?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it kind of helps to get to that. So yeah. Well, before we wrap up today, you've given us so much, and you've answered some questions I had that without me even asking. So thank you. You're so easy to interview.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yes. So, you know, this transition, this life experience, I mean, we've talked about it, we're not going to be going back to the old normal. We're going to be moving into whatever the new normal is. Um, and so as we manage this stress, we manage this acute trauma, we manage parenting and or not parenting, all of the things, right? What words of wisdom do you have that maybe I didn't ask you about today that you would like to share?
I think ultimately break it down, right? I think what I've been doing is trying to give advice that works for individuals. I have so much information for parents, for couples, for therapists, for people managing anxiety. And I think to break it down into smaller pieces of information as therapists is going to be helpful for them and for us. So when I do a live, for example, I try to topic it with something smaller so that I can have people not be inundated with information.
Mhm.
I think there's so much information to be had right now, and I think so many people are trying to be really helpful, which is wonderful. And if we can break that down for each other and give each other snippets of helpful pieces, that's going to be really great. I've done some of that, and you're welcome to it. I'm offering so many free things right now to help people have information. I think everybody's doing that. So I think, working together and that is just going to be really helpful. But the biggest piece of advice is just to give yourself some kindness and grace in all of this, and reach out to people that you need.
Yes. So kindness and grace to all of you out there.
Mhm.
Yes. I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate your time, and we will put below this video any links to any of your resources and information. And
Absolutely. Yeah, everybody's welcome to it. And I don't mind talking to other therapists and helping them in their path to getting more information about being an online worker or, resources that anybody needs. I'm happy to help.
great. Thank you so much for that. All right, everyone. This is Therapist Supporting Therapists. Please like or subscribe below, and thank you for watching.